Great. Okay, thank you. Over to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Caroline. And yeah, thanks, Richard. Hopefully this picks up on some of the themes you've just discussed. So yeah, I'm the site manager at Haweswater for the RSPB in the Lake District. As many of you will know, the Lake District is a little bit different to some of the uplands that Richard illustrated just there, in that it's not a landscape of extensive sort of plateau blanket bogs. It's a much more heterogeneous landscape. The geology is quite complex. And the area that I work in particularly, though it does have some quite large areas of blanket bog, the sort of really typical landscape is one of kind of hummocks and hollows, sort of thin soils on rocky hummocks, and then valley mires interspersing those at a whole range of different scales. And my job at Haweswater is all about habitat restoration, about habitat recovery. And I realized a few years ago that I didn't really have much of a sense of what we were restoring to, if you like. You know, our habitats in the UK have been so spectacularly impacted and degraded by human activity, illustrated by these 6 images, that it's pretty nigh on impossible to go anywhere to see intact habitat. It's certainly pretty much impossible to go and see pristine habitat. You know, we've impacted our uplands through forestry, through drainage, through grazing of domestic livestock, through unchecked populations of wild herbivores, through fertilizer use and pesticides and intensive agriculture, through burning. The whole, you know, raft of sort of human will has been bent upon our uplands to try to, you know, degrade them as much as we possibly can, seemingly. Next slide, please. So a few years ago, I was lucky enough to take advantage of one of the RSPB's sabbaticals. We get a sabbatical every 5 years for 4 weeks. And I thought, well, where can I go to see what good looks like, to see what intact upland habitat looks like in a place that is as comparable with the uplands of the UK and specifically the uplands of Haweswater, where I work, as possible. And so I settled on southwest Norway. And most of the observations in this presentation come from a valley called Fidjadalen, where I was lucky enough to spend about a week walking down the length of. And you can see it's about 480 miles between Haweswater and Fidjadalen. And southwest Norway is a very familiar landscape to any of you who've worked in the UK uplands. You know, created by the same period of geological activity. The tops are higher than our tops, but not that much higher. It is wetter and snowier, but not that much wetter. And you know, it's about as close as you can get to going somewhere that is like the uplands of the UK, but it has had a very different land management history. Next slide, please. Yeah, so just some more detail there on the sort of comparison with the weather. So the Lake District gets about 99 millimeters average annual rainfall. Fidjadalen gets 131. So it's wetter, but it's not that much wetter. The snow lies for much longer, as you'll see in some of the photos. I was there in June and there's still some snow lying. But the really distinctive thing is just how many species we share. So I was able to recognize almost all the species that I saw, not right down to the levels of individual moss species, but you know, all the flowering plants, pretty much all the birds, and a great many of the mammals and things as well. Next slide, please. So we tend to think of Norway today as being a very wealthy, prosperous nation, which indeed it is. But that is a relatively recent phenomenon. Until, excuse me, about 150 years ago, Norway was actually a very impoverished country. And things got so bad by the late 1800s, that there was a period of mass emigration. A huge number of people left, particularly from the rural areas, and they moved, sorry, annoying cough I've got. Many of them moved to the States. And before they left, the landscape actually looked an awful lot more like the uplands of the UK than it does today. People were farming with sheep, and as you can see from the right-hand side of the two pictures there, it was, broadly speaking, a treeless landscape by that point. That all of the trees had been cut down and people were burning peat, and there's lots of photographic evidence of piles of peat being stacked in a similar way as was carried out in the UK. And no sensible society is going to burn peat if there's timber available. So that basically shows you that the trees were gone. But it is a glacially carved landscape with these sort of refuges on the cliffs and ledges where some of the remnant vegetation was able to survive. And when the pressure came off the landscape during that period of emigration, those little pockets of remaining vegetation were able to effectively tumble back down into the landscape again. And there was effectively a century of unintended rewilding, and huge areas were just allowed to recover without any particular input from human beings. And so, as you can see from the left-hand side, you know, a vast reforestation has occurred. And so it was an extraordinary experience to walk through that landscape, which once upon a time was so similar to many of the uplands that we see today in the UK, but is now absolutely transformed. Next slide, please. So I started the valley started the walk at the top of the valley. So, you know, some amazing landscapes. This, as I said, was June. You can just about make out the little hiking cabins down at the bottom there. Lots and lots of open water, clearly very thin soil, but wherever there was soil, there was great diversity. So the sort of very wind tolerant, clipped sort of montane species growing in great profusion, and lots of invertebrate life making use of that. But yeah, obviously not a huge amount of peat up there, very thin soils. So it's a bit further down that the most relevant observations for this presentation were made. So if you could go on, please. So one of the interesting observations for me was about trees, and Richard's explanation there of the sort of the tree line, the climatic tree line. I had a bit of a realization in Norway that actually it's not altitude that dictates how high up trees can grow, that actually it's shelter. So really wherever there was shelter from the exposure of the wind in the places that I walked in Norway, there were trees. So this is a juniper growing at about 950 meters above sea level. And I saw rowans and willows and birches all reaching above 800 meters. And that's because the mountain tops were higher than our mountain tops. They were sort of 1100 meters in this valley in Fidjadalen. And quite often those valley tops were kind of stepped. So there would be areas of sort of shelter from the wind. Then there would be exposure, and then it would drop back down again. And in each one of those sheltered areas, there would be trees. So I think in those very exposed windswept blanket bogs where there is virtually no shelter from the wind, I'm sure Richard's quoted figures of the sort of the tree line are accurate. In the Lake District, I think it's very different. I think wherever you get shelter, even behind a rock, there is the capacity for trees to grow. So I think our idea of having a sort of fixed altitudinal limit for trees to grow is a little bit misleading in some places. Next slide, please. And so this is the area that to me was just heaven. So this is the sort of middle part of the valley, ranging from about 800 meters down to sort of 400 or 500. And it was much like the landscape that I look after at Haweswater, in that it was very geologically complex. There were these areas of sort of valley mires interspersed with rocky knolls. But the really distinguishing feature, as you can see from this photo, is just how many more trees there were. Trees were everywhere. At this particular elevation, they were dominated by birches, particularly the Betula tortuosa, Betula pubescens tortuosa subspecies, which is a thought to have resulted from a crossing between dwarf birch and downy birch sort of many times over. And it takes on this incredibly kind of contorted, twisted form that is able to tolerate sort of long periods of snowfall and a higher degree of exposure. Next slide, please. And so, you know, this is typical vegetation for this whole valley that I was walking down through. Areas of downy willow, which is that nice kind of bluey green shrub that you can see there. That was the dominant willow species, interspersed with lots of other things that we consider sort of moorland heath species. Lots and lots of bilberry, lots of bog bilberry as well, various species of heathers, and a great diversity of herb species, many of which we now consider as being sort of tall herb ledge vegetation plant communities. So we think of them as being plants that belong on cliffs. Actually, those are just the refuges that they've managed to cling on in as a result of widespread grazing almost everywhere else. Next slide. So this is one of those tortuosa birches. In fact, the one on the right-hand side, you can see it sort of leaning nonchalantly against that boulder. It's a really classic example. It is thought that we do have some of this subspecies present in the UK, certainly in Scotland, and there are various efforts going to collect seed from it in order to try to put it back to some of these very challenging upland situations. Next slide, please. So the bog vegetation consistently was really rich, really diverse. You can see here really nice sphagnum cover, cloudberry, bog rosemary, some dwarf birch in there as well, I think. And another interesting observation was that actually a lot of these bog species were found growing sort of outside what we would typically consider bogs on much thinner soils. And I suspect that they are probably more tolerant of a wider range of conditions than we give them credit for. I think bogs have probably given some of these species a bit of a refuge from grazing, because grazing animals will tend to avoid wet areas if they have the choice. And so, you know, I was seeing cloudberry growing in sort of much drier conditions, and actually often look much sort of larger and more robust and happier outside of the bogs. So again, some interesting sort of botanical observations. Next slide, please. And this was a really typical scene. So you'd have these very rich, very intact, unmolested peat bodies with lots of open water, really rich sphagnum cover. And then on the drier rocky knolls where the soils were a little thinner, still peaty soils underneath, those would have good covering of birch and willows and other tree species. Next slide, please. Some of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with this particular species. White-faced darter is probably the commonest dragonfly species that I saw on my trip in southwest Norway. I was only there for a limited time period, so it probably coincided with the kind of peak flight season for this species. But it's one that needs both bogs and trees. So as an indicator of that sort of bog woodland, that interaction between woodland areas and peatland areas, this is probably the kind of the key ecological indicator, I would suggest. It has become a very, very rare species in the UK. It's been reintroduced into a couple of places in Cumbria. And again, I think it's a species that we've probably got a little bit wrong. We think that what it needs is the places that we found it, its refugee habitat. And often people suggest that it needs deep water at the edges of mires, in ditches, peat workings, basically. Actually, I think that is just a proxy for its optimal habitat conditions, which is these bog woodlands. And it just happens to be that those deeper areas of water along those peat edges happen to be where the bog and the trees interact. Next slide, please. Lots of beavers in Norway as well. From a very, very low base, they have spread widely, and almost certainly they help to blur those boundaries between peatland and woodland habitats, and create those rich ecotones between the two. Next slide. The water was spectacularly clear everywhere I went, and again, I was there for a month, so it's not exactly a rigorous sort of sampling period and representative of the whole time, but this was a landscape that had a lot of peat in it. Whenever we walk across upland landscapes in the UK, we are very used to seeing our peatland water, our streams flowing through peatlands running that tea-coloured brown, and I don't think that they should be. I think where you have intact peat with a good, healthy vegetation there and lots of trees holding those peatland areas in those peatland soils in place, water flowing through those landscapes will remain clear. And I had a very enjoyable time swimming in many of these spectacular river pools in a way that I would not have enjoyed anything like as much if they were tea stained brown like the ones in the UK are. Next slide, please. So the biggest difference really is the grazing. So one notable difference between the UK and Norway is I think our peatlands have been physically degraded through drainage, through burning, through peat cutting, much more so than the ones that I observed in Norway. But that aside, the biggest difference that has resulted in the recovery from the picture on the left to the picture on the right is an absence of grazing. So sheep were basically removed entirely, and deer were kept at a very, very low level, partly through poverty and people hunting them, partly because there are still native carnivores in place, but also because Norway has a very effective system of hunting that maintains deer numbers at a much, much lower level than they are anywhere in the UK. Next slide, please. And yet these are still now cultural, agricultural landscapes. So during my walk down through Fidjadalen, I was there just as the sheep were coming back to the hill. They tend to arrive back in June after the snow is disappearing. They graze for around 3 or 4 months until the snow starts to come back again. But they typically graze at a level which is about 1/5 of the typical grazing density of sheep on the fells in Cumbria, for example. So something like 0.2 ewes per hectare just for that summer period. It is grazing which is very similar to the hill farming of the Lake District. It's communally managed. There is a system much like hefting, which has got all of those kind of cultural associations. I did see some cattle grazing as well, so you could perhaps just about make them out. There's some Highland cattle. Didn't see anything like as many of those as I did sheep. But because this landscape is so recovered, is so rich, that actually the detrimental impact of the sheep grazing is so much reduced. You know, yes, they are grazing out palatable species here and there. Yes, they are taking tree seedlings, but the habitat has reached such a healthy state that it can withstand that, and the sheep really have, you know, very minimal negative impact. Next slide, please. I just said all that, didn't realize that slide was coming. Worth noting also actually that farming is typically in Norway part of a kind of wider, much more integrated rural economy. So most of the farmers are not farmers full time. They are farmers as well as doing a little bit of forestry. They will rent out hiking cabins on their lands. They will often trade in hunting permits, and most will have a kind of a proper job as well, if you like. So, you know, farming, nobody is trying to make their living out of farming, and that means that its intensity hasn't ratcheted up anything like as much as it has in the UK. Norway balances its sheep production against its demand. So there are something like 1 million sheep and lambs, I think, in Norway, and there is no import or export market. So they just produce what they need. Again, very, very different to the UK, where we export a huge amount, we import a huge amount, and the whole thing is much more of a commodity industry that has a huge number of negative impacts. There is also a very generous subsidy system for farming and for environmental improvement. Next slide, please. One really significant difference between Norway and the UK is the pattern of land ownership. So huge areas of the upland areas, the central sort of mountains, are owned by the state, and most of the rest of the land holdings are very, very small and privately owned. So it's a completely different scenario to our concentration of land ownership in a very small number of hands. You know, the big estates, the organisations like the National Trust and the RSPB. You know, it is a much more diverse pattern of private ownership in Norway. Next slide, please. So the immediate response whenever you say to folk that you know, to suggest that maybe we could try to do something similar in the UK is like, well, Norway is a much less densely populated country than the UK, and that is of course true. But actually, if you break things down into smaller units of geography within the country, actually, as this graph shows, you know, the Lake District, the Highland region, is actually much, much less densely populated than sort of equivalent regions in most of Norway. So, you know, once you take out those kind of big urban centres, there is a lot of space in our upland landscapes that we could deliver this kind of, we could encourage this kind of recovery, should we choose to. Next slide, please. So a very just brief mention of hunting. Norway is very proudly a sort of pro-hunting nation, but the hunting that's practiced there is so incredibly different to what is done over here. Although carnivores are kept in check to a degree, that's really through competition. Farmers, sort of Norwegian people tend to see the wolves and the lynx as kind of taking their game, if you like. But what doesn't tend to happen in Norway in anything like the intensity that it happens here is there isn't much in the way of modification of the habitat in order to artificially boost quarry species, such as, you know, grouse moor management over here. There is very small scale burning that takes place, but it's incredibly small scale just to try to promote more kaluna in order to boost willow grouse, red grouse. But hunting is typically a communal activity. Everything that's shot is eaten. There are local processing places for, you know, dealing with deer and reindeer, and the density of the quarry species, the deer in particular, is incredibly low. As a result, it's much harder to hunt those animals. So, you know, hunting is typically a sort of multi-day activity, and the infrastructure is there to support that. The hiking cabins that are dotted across the uplands of Norway are fantastic, very usable, very comfortable. Yeah, it's something that people are incredibly proud of, and I would say has a, you know, a very overall probably a positive impact on the state of the environment by regulating the deer numbers. Next slide, please.
Lee, 5-minute check from me.
Yeah, this is my last slide actually.
Perfect.
So lessons. Southwest Norway has a very comparable ecology to much of the UK uplands, but the separation between the habitats, especially bogs and woodlands, are much blurrier. The refuges that many of our upland species find themselves in confirm that grazing is the major factor affecting our upland areas. It's, you know, we've got these tiny little pockets of habitat that are just waiting to be released on many of our cliffs and crags if we were only to give them a chance. With changes to grazing, and I mean domesticated grazing as well as wild animals, there is no ecological reason why our upland landscapes couldn't look similar to parts of southwest Norway. It's only politics and social attitudes that are preventing that from happening. Next slide, please. Small plug, there are a couple of chapters in my book that go into all of this stuff in a lot more detail, should you wish to know more. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Lee. Fabulous. What a treat to get to visit that part of the world and see some very beautiful landscapes. Well, likewise for Richard and some of the peatlands you've been to. Really interesting, that refuge habitat principle. I think that was touched on in Isabella Tree's wilding book as well, isn't it? That not to assume where we see things now is actually what they need. It's where they've been sort of pushed back into. Yeah, really interesting. Super. Right, I will end the recording and I will hand over to Tia, who's been fielding questions coming in for you both, and ask her to read some of them out.